Okay, so good morning. So I see we have many people joining us. So I'm Kimberly McGuire, and I want to thank you for joining us and being part of the Brain Injury Association of New Jersey's annual seminar. So before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to enter your full name in the chat, that this is our virtual sign-in sheet. And if you are going to request CEUs, remember that you must attend this workshop in its entirety, complete the workshop evaluation, and if required by your discipline, you will receive a post test. I will be entering that link in the chat for your convenience, the evaluation link. Zoom will provide a report of how long each of you stayed in the workshop, and CEUs cannot be given if attendance is not verified. So questions are encouraged, and please enter your questions in the chat and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Okay, so this workshop is titled Cultural Diversity and Traumatic Brain Injury Rehabilitation, and our presenter is Dr. Anthony Lacarica, and he received his doctoral degree in clinical psychology with a specialization in neuropsychology from Wayne State University. He currently holds a dual position as senior research scientist at Kessler Foundation's Center for TBI Research, with a clinical appointment as staff neuropsychologist at Kessler Institute for Rehabilitation. He has over 50 peer-reviewed publications reflecting his research on sleep-wake abnormalities after brain injury and the effects of cultural and socio-demographic factors on rehabilitation outcomes. Dr. Lacarica is very well respected in his areas of research, and I will hand it over to him.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my screen. So, okay. So can everyone see the
So they won't be able to tell you, but I can see it. Yes.
Okay.
I see it.
All right. So, so I am going to be talking about issues of cultural diversity and traumatic brain injury rehabilitation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some basic.
Can I interrupt you for one minute, Dr. Lacarica? Sure. I don't know if you know this, but you have two slides are showing. So you have your current slide, and then it's showing your next slide.
How's this? Is that better?
There you go. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to talk about some basic terminology, a little bit about the research on health disparities and traumatic brain injury outcomes. I'll talk a little bit about cultural issues in the rehabilitation setting, and then go over some ideas regarding intercultural sensitivity and culturally humble approaches that kind of talk a little bit about a mindset that kind of can be very effective in cross-cultural situations. So just to show you a trend in research, there's a great increase in interest in issues of culture and ethnicity or race. So this is just using PubMed and a search, and you can see in 5-year periods, the 2017, and we're not even completely through 2021, and there's a huge increase in the number of publications over the years looking at issues of cultural diversity. So, what is culture? It's basically beliefs and practices that are shared within a population, which itself may share attributes such as race, ethnicity, religion, language, gender identity, sexual orientation, disabilities, or geographic space. There's a lot of emphasis on improving equity and I'm going to talk about health disparities within brain injury care, and then try and help to navigate towards what we can do about this. Um, so, just to give it a background, what race, ethnicity, race specifically is an anthropological construct, and it's basically used to classify modern humans based on a combination of things like physical characteristics, social and cultural characteristics, as well as ancestry. And, it all started, many years ago with attempts being made to see it as a physical science, looking at the structure of bone structure, eyes, facial features. But today, race is really viewed as multi-determined, and what's really emphasized is racial identity, or how a person identifies themselves, which is the best way to think about it in terms of a patient-centered model of care. Ethnicity, an ethnic group, consists of a population of persons who practice a common culture, and this may be centered around having a common language, religion, food, beliefs, or customs, and share a common ancestry. So there is some overlap between the two. When we A lot of times you'll see, in especially lately in publications, the term race slash ethnicity. And so there's usually ethnicity, especially with the US Census, it's reserved for, usually Hispanic. They ask that question, are you Hispanic, yes or no? And that's considered ethnicity. And then everything else is race, although there have been some changes to this. But what they were finding was, in the US Census, a large percentage of those identifying as other for the race question turned out to be of Hispanic ethnicity. And the Pew Research Center actually sampled a large sample of Hispanic adults and found that 66% viewed Hispanic as their racial background, and that had a difficult time responding to a question once they said they were Hispanic, then asked about race. Technically, a large percentage of Hispanics who are from Latin America do have ancestry that involves European, African, and a mixture of indigenous. But how someone identifies and what their identity is really what we're talking about here today. And separating race and ethnicity has been criticized by the American Anthropological Association and U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. So this term race ethnicity, it allows Hispanics to be included at the level of racial identity used to identify, white, Black, Asian. You may also see in publications non-Hispanic Black or non-Hispanic white. And when you look at the totals, Hispanics end up being the third largest, with white and Black accounting for the largest percentage of the population. And this becomes more and more complicated as we evolve as a society and people have multiracial identities. So why is this important? Why do we need labels? Why do we have to label each other? Aren't we all human beings? And, it's important to understand how people self-identify. Number one, it conveys a sense of respect, and it helps us better interact with others. Also, developing a patient-centered plan of care can maximize the effectiveness of treatment and improve patient outcomes when we approach things from a culturally sensitive perspective. So this is, as we've become increasingly diverse, a one-size-fits-all approach falls short of achieving optimal outcomes after brain injury. And these categories are not perfect, but they do help us with a starting point. And they usually, most of the research historically has been looking at inequalities that are, by these different categorizations. And in that sense, they're important to help us understand what's going on as a first step. And then we can develop ways to counteract whatever systemic forces may be perpetuating marginalization and leading to these health disparities. So by a health disparity, it's basically a systematic pattern of differences in health outcomes that either occurs by race, ethnicity, by education, income, disability, geography, or gender identity or sexual orientation. And this is a model that actually was developed within spinal cord injury, but it really does apply to brain injury as well. It's a very complex, the reason for these, we're still really trying to disentangle the many reasons why there are these disparities. And so there are things like provider factors, there are individual factors within the person, their cultural beliefs, there are healthcare systems, systemic factors, and these all really contribute and interact with the person's environment and circumstances to result in a lot of these disparities in outcomes having to do with the person's community integration and their satisfaction with life and quality of life. So with regard to traumatic brain injury, there's a growing body of research that has been looking at differences and starting with the risk for TBI. Early on, there was some research looking at those living in lower income neighborhoods where there are higher crime rates and higher instances of drug abuse. Racial ethnic minorities are more likely to have a traumatic brain injury from a violent etiology. And then there are, in my practice, I see a lot of individuals with who are immigrants. And one demographic that I often see as I do neuropsychological assessments in Spanish are immigrants that come to this country for a better life, and they work really hard, but they have manual labor jobs and they carry with them a lot of risk. Sometimes these jobs are unregulated or off the books, and they may have poor working conditions or lack of proper safety equipment that may contribute to a higher incidence or higher risk of injury. And then this also causes problems later on, which I'll get into later, for outcomes when someone can't return to that same manual labor job, and then they're at a disadvantage for maybe not speaking English or having a lower education. There's been some research looking at mortality rates among veterans with traumatic brain injury, finding that it's higher among Hispanics. Higher mortality risk, even after adjusting for other sociodemographic characteristics and comorbidities. There are a lot of studies that have looked at post-hospitalization after trauma. So racial ethnic minorities have been found to be more likely to be discharged home after acute care services. They're less likely to receive rehabilitation therapies like physical, occupational, and speech therapy. Whether or not they are admitted to an inpatient rehabilitation setting, they are looking at the incidence of receiving physical, occupational, and speech therapy in any setting is lower. They're also less likely to be discharged to inpatient rehabilitation. Older Medicare patients who are Black and Hispanic were less likely to be discharged to a higher level of rehabilitation. And in a lot of cases, individuals may be more likely to be sent to maybe a subacute rather than an acute, where in subacute they may not be receiving as intense physical, occupational, speech, and therapeutic recreation therapies. And in a lot of these studies, these differences persist even after controlling for injury severity. In many of the studies, also controlled for health insurance. So that health insurance is an issue that definitely does contribute to the quality of care. And it's tied into a lot of issues with socioeconomic status and employment and other issues. But even after controlling for those, a lot of these studies did find that the differences persisted. We did a study a few years ago looking at non-English speaking individuals with TBI. They were, despite having equivalent of scores in communication using the FIM, or what the functional independence measure, at admission, at discharge, those who were non-English speaking had significantly lower scores in their communication ratings. And it's unclear whether this reflects some kind of a systematic bias in measuring improvement in communication, or it may indicate a reduced ability to benefit from services, especially where the speech language pathology service may not have resources to deal with uh, to as well with individuals that don't speak English. With regard to those who do receive rehabilitation, there are differences in functional outcomes. For example, minorities have worse functional outcomes at 1 year post-injury. And again, this is controlling for sociodemographic injury and functional characteristics at admission. And then among Hispanics, a study found that they were similar to whites following acute rehabilitation. However, when they looked at 1 year post-injury, they were 3 times more likely to be worse. And this was controlling for other sociodemographic injury and functional characteristics at admission, which leads to questions regarding follow-up care and other reasons why they would be equal at discharge and then a year later not be progressing at the same rate as whites. With regard to employment outcomes, minorities are 2.2 times more likely than whites to be unemployed at 1 year post-injury. And the odds for minorities in a study that looked at employment stability, which was determined as being being stably employed, was defined as being employed at the 3 consecutive follow-up time points, whereas unstably employed was inconsistently employed, and then and unemployed was the other category. So the minorities were 3.6 times more likely to be unemployed versus stably employed, 1.9 times greater for being unstably employed versus being stably employed, and 1.9 times greater for being unemployed versus being unstably employed. So job stability is also an issue. Studies that have looked at life satisfaction outcomes have found that African Americans have poorer self-reported life satisfaction compared with Asians and Caucasians 1 year after TBI. And life satisfaction was better for those who were married, better for those who were employed, and worse for those who had a violent etiology. So a lot of these studies are pointing out these differences, and I like this framework by Kilborn. It kind of shows 3 different levels of research. And where I think we are now with traumatic brain injury, we're still kind of in this detecting and understanding area. And in the analyses that I do and that I'm involved in, I'm trying to really push this from, okay, we know there are these differences, but I try and include in the statistical models enough of confounding factors and demographics to kind of tease apart why this is. It's a very complex issue. When we look at racial ethnic disparities, we know that it's not just the race of a person or their ethnic identity that is the reason behind it. It's a complex interaction of that with other things, both internal cultural issues and external environmental issues and systemic issues, and it can be very complicated. So I think the ultimate goal is to reduce these disparities and make sure everyone has equity in the way that they're treated. But we're still kind of in this detecting and understanding mode. And trying to push the needle a little further over. So the issues are complex, and the best model, I think, is looking at things from a social determinants of health perspective, that there are all of these issues that interact and contribute to disparities. in different ways. And in the statistical models we use when we do research, it's important to try and account for these as best we can to understand the relative contributions of these different factors so that we know where to place our emphasis and what things we can do to actually affect change. So, here's some examples, within economic stability or socioeconomic status, things like employment, someone's income, employment, whether or not they have a job is number one, but then the type of job they have, the income, does it provide enough income to live on? What are their expenses monthly? What is the debt that they have that, all contributes to their overall socioeconomic status? Medical bills they have, support they may have. Within the neighborhood and the physical environment, we think about things like housing, the quality of the housing, are people forced to live in situations where there are, large numbers of people, crammed into a single dwelling? Are there transportation issues, ability to get to doctor's appointments, ability to go shopping and things like that? Things like safety in the neighborhood, violent crimes, and the ability to walk. I think a lot about with neighborhood and disability, things like curb cuts on sidewalks and the quality of, someone in a wheelchair being able to navigate in the environment is very important. Things like food, and not only access to food, but quality food and healthy options. And sometimes even, I think a big problem is that sometimes some of the healthiest food is the most expensive. And, this is an issue. Community and social contexts, things like social integration, the makeup of the neighborhood, support systems, community engagement, and the experience of discrimination in one's daily life. Things like education, we think about literacy and someone's ability to understand the health information that we provide to them. Things like language, ability to understand English, early childhood education, things like vocational training and higher education. Within the healthcare system, we think about things like health coverage, the type of insurance someone has, the availability of providers, the quality of care received, and the linguistic and cultural competency of the providers themselves. All of these things it's complex, but I think it is doable. And I think, as we move forward in research and start to think more about these things and actually include things where we can account for these, I think will move us closer to the goal of having a better understanding of how to find solutions to these issues. So this is an example of, my attempt to kind of move things in the direction of being more inclusive of these social determinants of health. And so this was kind of a study that grew out of my personal experience growing up Puerto Rican. My grandmother didn't speak English, having to go with her to doctor's appointments and translate, and thinking about the patients that I see and what a disadvantage they have when they don't speak English. And so I wanted to look at immigrants. And so using the Traumatic Brain Injury Model Systems database, we looked at a large sample of Hispanics with traumatic brain injury and examined the neighborhood characteristics. One thing that I always felt, there's a tendency of a lot of immigrants to kind of navigate towards living in ethnic enclaves where they feel more comfortable and people speak their language. But with my grandmother, who lived many, many years in the Bronx, she didn't have to learn English and was able to do everything without learning English. I thought maybe that would be a hindrance, and wanted to see what is the effect of the proportion of foreign language speakers in one's neighborhood. And so when we looked by nativity, or where someone was born, whether they were born in the US or born abroad, for US born Hispanics, there was no significant effect of the neighborhood proportion of foreign language speakers on their productivity at 1 year post-traumatic brain injury. However, for immigrants, among immigrants, those who were living in areas with higher proportions of foreign language speakers were 2.8 times more likely to be engaged in productive activity, which was defined as being employed or volunteering or being a full-time student. And when you look by the neighborhood, for those living in areas with higher percentage of foreign language speakers, there was really no relationship between place of birth and productivity. So, living in a neighborhood where there's a higher language incident, a higher proportion of foreign language speakers, it kind of nullifies this relationship between place of birth and productivity. So immigrants are not at a disadvantage. However, for those in areas where there were lower percentage of foreign language speakers, US-born individuals were 2.7 times more likely to be engaged in productive activity compared with immigrants. So, Hispanics living in ethnic enclaves often find employment through social connections. And so in this case, it was of benefit to be living in that kind of environment. Immigrants with limited English proficiency may be at a particular disadvantage in seeking employment after TBI if they live in areas with lower proportion of foreign language speakers. And so knowing the cultural aspects of the residential environment can be useful to, case managers who are involved in planning for rehabilitation discharge and setting up follow-up care, and also for things like vocational counseling to kind of understand the context where the person's living and, aspects of their lived environment that might be contributing to their success or failure at returning to work. So another area is that culture can affect is understanding of illness and reduced awareness of traumatic brain injury and what constitutes a traumatic brain injury can result in a failure to recognize, they may misinterpret or minimize symptoms, discount the urgency of the need for care, and it can also contribute to poor participation in treatment plans or follow-up if the person has a poor understanding of their condition. This can be affected by low education attainment, or even in someone who has 12 years of education or more, the quality of education is not always equal. And so having education in an area where it's of very poor quality can have an impact. This can, reduce health literacy is an issue, and lack of access to information such as that provided by, on the internet. A lot of us take for granted that we can just Google anything if we have a question about anything and find out information, whereas not everybody has internet access. And brochures that provided by clinicians should be in the appropriate language, the appropriate reading level for that particular person. So studies have been done looking at misconceptions and among minorities, and a study found that a higher percentage of misconceptions regarding traumatic brain injury were linked to lower education, those who were Spanish speaking, and those who were foreign born. Single session education intervention complete with a manual that was at a 6th grade reading level, provided either in Spanish or English, was effective at reducing a lot of these misconceptions. There's a lot of other reasons that can influence healthcare utilization among various minority groups, and this could be a mistrust of the healthcare system. Sometimes previous experiences may be negative with interacting with the healthcare system, maybe not feeling understood. One huge issue is that the professional, it differs by location, but in some settings, there's a great lack of racial ethnic representation in treatment settings, so that the clinicians, the racial ethnic makeup of the clinicians and the cultural diversity within the clinicians does not represent the makeup of the general public. and so that who we serve. And so this is can be an issue. Um, a lot of there's also cultural influences that have to do with preference for alternative treatments, things like home remedies or faith-based healing approaches. Um, and then there's lack of access, things like transportation, health insurance coverage, overcrowding in free clinics, long wait times, um, things of that nature. So in the rehabilitation setting, the cultural issues can really have an impact on one's perception of disability. And you know, a lot of individuals who are immigrants who I've worked with, uh, especially when I used to work on the spinal cord injury unit, they have a very negative opinion of disability because of their experience in their country of origin and the way that individuals with disability are, uh, you know, they may not have the same opportunities that are afforded in the United States. Um, and accessibility and resources and things like that are, you know, the way someone perceives, uh, you know, an event like a traumatic brain injury and how that can change their life has a lot to do with their previous exposure to disability. There's often an impact on gender roles. So in certain cultures, the gender roles may be more strictly defined. And in any culture, you know, as clinicians, we should always be thinking about gender and giving treatment that is appropriate, um, because there are definite differences in how people respond to injury. Um, and you know, injury can result in changes that threaten identity. I mentioned before a lot of individuals, Hispanic individuals that had manual labor jobs that have a brain injury, and now they have you know, vertigo. They can't climb a ladder anymore. They can't do manual labor, and that was their livelihood. That as a provider for their family, that's how they you know, that was their identity, was being a provider. And so it, you know, having an injury like this can have an impact on multiple levels. Um, and then, you know, the issue of brain injury being a hidden disability, uh, you know, impairment may not always be directly apparent, and it may be difficult for friends and family to understand. And this is true of anyone. But when addressing this and providing education to family, a culturally sensitive approach is always good for you know, providing information in a way that the person can digest and their family can digest within their cultural context. You know, religion is another area of diversity. In some racial ethnic groups, religion is very much tied to one's identity. And this can affect things like attribution, the questioning of, you know, which many people go through after an injury is, you know, why did this happen to me? A life-changing event. There's often a cultural context in the search for meaning. Some may interpret it as a punishment from God for sins that they have committed in the past. In some cultures, there may be a belief that there is a curse that was placed upon them, and they have to take steps to remove the curse. And this can have an impact on their engagement in treatment, especially when they're in the rehabilitation setting where they have to really put a lot of effort into helping themselves. And things like learning to use adaptive devices. And I've had patients that were very resistant to using adaptive devices because they felt that that was not showing faith that God was going to heal them, and that they, you know, just by participating in the use of those devices was a lack of faith on their part. And for some people, the saying, you know, God helps those who help themselves can resonate, but not all. And so in a lot of cases, this is where pastoral counseling can really be helpful. And you know, most institutions have access to a wide variety of religious counselors. In many cultures, family is valued over the individual, and extended family may live together in under one roof. And so, on one hand, there may be a great potential for sharing the burden of caregiving, but we shouldn't always assume. And family may be more willing to participate, uh, but there's also a risk of over-involvement. In a setting where they're, especially in the inpatient rehabilitation, where uh, patients are being encouraged to be more independent, and uh, a family member that may have a traditional social role of being doing everything for the someone when they're sick, trying to educate them that it's important to allow them to do more things for themselves as they progress through their rehabilitation. Sometimes finding alternative means for them to be included in the process is helpful. Giving them a way to support the patient in performing activities without doing it for them. And these are very simple things that can make a huge difference. Um, Also, family, may not always be willing or able to participate in care, and it's important to explore options. One particular barrier with regard to family is often visitation, and there may be transportation barriers where they can't visit. Finding ways to also finding ways to minimize disturbance to the patient and others. That this actually referred to a situation that where there was a death, and a family member was displaying very culturally appropriate reaction to the death, but and security was called with a fear that they were there was a concern for other patients and disruptive nature, but separating the family members was from a cultural standpoint not the best way. So having um, social work involved, and moving the family member to an area where they can grieve in a culturally appropriate way that was not disruptive to other patients was something that was important, rather than punishing them by removing them from the premises for being disruptive. Um, and providing family education in appropriate language is important. It's very common to use for family members to be used as interpreters. As I said, I went to multiple doctor appointments with my grandmother, but it's not always ideal. And in some cases may be downright inappropriate. So it's something to be mindful of. So it's important to be familiar with available interpreter services. There are guidelines for using interpreters, especially with regard to using an interpreter for assessments. Through the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society has a white paper on things, and a lot of times it's a good idea to, if possible, meet with the interpreter beforehand, let them know the purpose of the interaction so that it can be as effective as possible. Some other issues that are doctor-patient roles. So doctors are often seen as being an authority figure in certain cultures, and people may be more likely to defer to doctor decisions without question, be less likely to speak up and ask questions, be likely to say that they understood everything that was explained to them to avoid conflict. This role is not always compatible with rehabilitation. This is a setting where the patient has to take on an active role, and this may be something that is not familiar to people from other cultures. And so it's important to kind of have this in mind when you're trying to promote this idea of involvement in goal setting and things like that, and taking the time to just explain how things work in the rehabilitation setting, which for those of us that work in rehabilitation, it's often something we don't, it's second nature, but for patients that are not familiar with rehabilitation, it's something that deserves some explanation. So with regard to assessment, this is a huge area that we still have a long way to go. Tests developed in Anglo-American or white samples may not be applicable to other cultures. And this is true even if the measure is rigorously translated or using an interpreter, the score may not maintain the same meaning across cultures. This is especially true with standardized neuropsychological tests. They may be less valid when the examinee is not reflected in the normative sample. So with neuropsychological tests, we actually get a raw score that is then compared with an age-matched sample of peers. And if the peers are not truly peers, the standardized score is meaningless, and we can't really interpret the results. And you know, this is even true of nonverbal tests. You know, a lot of times people say, well, you know, there's a language barrier, so make sure you avoid language tests and stick with nonverbal tests. But a lot of the nonverbal tests are developed in the United States and are based on the educational system that we have, where we learn certain things at each grade level, and individuals in other cultures that come from other educational backgrounds may not have the same kind of standardized education that we have in the United States. And this is a huge issue. In a lot of cultures, the education is really consists of training individuals to be in ways that are going to advance them within that culture. So if someone comes from a very rural farming community, they're going to learn things that are going to be specific for them to thrive within that community. And when there's not as much standardization across educational institutions, this can be an issue. There's also, you know, different levels of, you know, there are cases where people maybe come from a rural environment where they have a single classroom where they have people 4th through 6th grade, and the teacher goes from group to group teaching reading and writing. You know, finding out about someone's educational background may be important, especially with regard to neuropsychological tests, where this plays a huge role in performance on cognitive measures. So it's important to use appropriate normative data for any kind of standardized test. So acculturation is something that it's basically the degree to which one assimilates to the worldviews of the majority culture. And so, you know, there are things that really, it's been shown to be have an effect on a number of different things, such as you know, how people perform on standardized tests and things of that nature. Some commonly used indicators or proxies are length of time in the United States. However, this is not a perfect proxy for acculturation because, as I said, my grandmother lived in the Bronx for many years and didn't learn English. So, you know, she lived within an ethnic enclave. And so the length of time in the United States really was not a great reflection of acculturation. So you have to consider the degree of cultural integration. Something that is probably more powerful is the age that in which the person immigrated to the United States. And the reason is because this reflects where the majority of their education was obtained. And education in this country is a forced acculturation. You know, they have, you know, it's very structured and mandatory. And so there are measures that of acculturation. Most of these focus on language, English fluency, literacy, or the relative dominance. Nowadays, the bicultural model is more widely accepted. So we realize that people don't completely acculturate, or they may acculturate at different levels. And most people maintain, you know, a majority of cultural beliefs from their culture of origin. So we have to be clear on what we're talking about. So there is some controversy in the acculturation literature as to what we're really talking about. But it's kind of a bicultural model is really more accurate, looking at what is retained from the original culture, which actually may have value as well in giving the person a sense of worth and making up their identity. But so research is kind of evolving also in the area of acculturation. So this is an example of a measurement. There's a community integration questionnaire which looks at someone's community participation, and it has 3 subscales. And these 3 subscales of home competency, social integration, and productive activity were derived through factor analysis. So that's a kind of a very data-driven process where you look at the items and how individuals respond and how items cluster together. And in this study, we looked at how individuals, we chose the 3 largest racial ethnic groups, which had the largest sample size, to see whether this 3-factor model would fit equally across all 3 racial ethnic groups. And so the findings were the model was acceptable for those who identified as white, lower for those who identified as Black, and it had a very poor fit for those who identified as Hispanic. So the items may not be culturally relevant, or the activities may not be great indicators of community integration in a given cultural context. And in fact, Angel Sanders found that racial ethnic differences were really important in community activities. So it's important any measure of community integration should be inclusive of things that are important to individuals. So the oh, I'm sorry, I went too far. Another study looked at research, and in addition to trying to provide the most culturally sensitive clinical treatment we can, it's important to also consider in a research context. And so another study using the traumatic brain injury model systems looked at the retention rate. So in the model systems study, it's a national database with 16 centers across the United States. And individuals are followed at 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, and every 5 years after their traumatic brain injury. And so this study looked at retention over time in the according to race ethnicity at the 1 to 2 follow-up year period. And it was found to be lower for Hispanics. They also found that it was lower with increasing age. And they also controlled for those who were deceased, so that's not an issue, but increasing age has an impact on follow-up. Those with lower levels of pre-injury education, and the odds of being retained were greater for those discharged to a private residence and greater for those with nonviolent etiologies. And those with a history of problem substance use were less likely to be retained among white and Black participants, but this same did not hold for among Hispanics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural competence. It's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together, basically to try and help work effectively in cross-cultural situations. It's really developing cultural competence is a process. Cultural competence is you hear a lot about it, and but it kind of gives the impression of this is the endpoint. So you take a course on cultural competence, and there you are culturally competent. But I think it has some limitations. I think it gives you the idea that learning facts about culture are it's really a process and not an endpoint. The problem, it's great to learn about other cultures, and I think everyone should really, learn about other cultures. It's great. It's something I feel I'm constantly learning about other cultures. Even as a Hispanic, I work with people from so many different backgrounds that, depending on even the Spanish that I use, I find people that have different words for different things across Latin American countries. So but it's a process. It's kind of a lifelong process. Um, so the idea of cultural humility is really drives that point home of a lifelong process, the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other oriented and really in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are most important to the person. It originates from constructs of humility and differentiation of self. It has both an intrapersonal and interpersonal. So part of it is understanding your own emotions, your own biases, your own, seeing the world through your own lens, and then being able to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, so to speak. It involves three main features: a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, a desire to fix power imbalances where none ought to exist, and then aspiration to develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. Sometimes it's hard to enact change if you don't have buy-in at the systemic level, and it's a challenge. But I think there are things that we can do as individuals that can really move things in the right direction. So it's great to educate yourself about other cultures, but while there are shared experiences within a given culture, we have to respect the individual's experience and how it shapes their perceptions, emotions, and their behaviors. And that when you learn about other cultures, file those facts away and keep them in mind as possibilities to be aware of them, but be careful not to stereotype and make no assumptions. We all see the world through a lens colored by our lifetime of personal experiences. Knowing your own culture and understanding how you see the world and that others may not see it the same way. Communicating with others who are willing to share their cultural viewpoints, and asking the clients we serve, about how they see the world, and may help us to better serve them. And being open to seeing things from different perspectives. The hardest thing is being willing to look inward and examine potential sources of unconscious bias. And it's tough because they're many times unconscious, but sometimes it just takes some reflection to realize, how you may handle a given situation. And interacting with others, sometimes they'll point it out to you that, if you have a comfortable enough relationship. I'd like to kind of just give you this parable of the elephant in the dark. So, I think this kind of illustrates the idea of cultural humility. So a group of travelers encounter an elephant for the first time in their lives. They've never seen an elephant before, and it's a very dark night. They can't see anything, so they have to go by their sense of touch. So one person feels the side of the elephant and says, the elephant is like a wall. And another person feels the tail and says, no, the elephant's not like a wall. It's like a rope. It's obvious. It's a rope. This is a rope. And another one feels the leg and says, this is the trunk of a tree. And so everyone has a different perspective, and no one is really seeing the full picture. So the culturally humble sequel that I created to this is, for person one to kind of communicate with person two and say, why do you say this is like a tree? I only feel a snake. And person two, follow the sound of my voice, stand where I stand and feel what I feel. And, everyone is correct in their perception. No one is right and no one is wrong, but, it's only through understanding of others can we really truly experience the big picture. So as clinicians, we really need to take the initiative to follow the sound of our client's voice and ask for guidance to help us understand how to best help them. And as researchers, we have to be sensitive to cultural factors that impact the comfort of our participants and their ethical treatment, the data collection process and the quality of the information that we collect, and the way we analyze data to arrive at conclusions, and then how we disseminate our findings to reach diverse populations so that they can know what's going on with the research, that especially those who participate, so that they know of the outcomes. I am trying to be mindful of the time. Okay, we're okay. I'm going to go really quickly through this. This is just a mental model of intercultural sensitivity. And I think this is useful because it explains how people or groups tend to think about cultural differences. And what's really interesting about this is so on the left side, it has ethnocentric stages, and then on the right, ethno-relative, which is greater cultural sensitivity. And what's really interesting is I, at least for myself, when I look at this, I find, well, on some things, I'm kind of more to the left, and I'm very, embarrassed that I'm a little over on the left side, and then other things I'm more to the right. But so it ranges from denial to defense to minimization. Minimization is interesting, and I just want to point this out. This is kind of the idea that we're all the same. We're all human beings. We're all we all want the same thing, and if we just why don't we just let's just focus on what we all have in common, and then we'll all be better off if we just realize how we're alike. I mean, its commonalities are important, and finding common ground is important, but not at the expense of understanding how disparities can have a real impact on people's lives. One example of this, I'm going to just say my in-laws live out in Michigan, and one of them made a comment, and with the Black Lives Matter movement, it said, well, all lives matter. And so this is kind of the minimization level. And yes, all lives matter, but Black Lives Matter is important because it's really addressing an inequality and something where we need a little more attention on this issue to improve equity across the board. So someday, in an ideal world, once systemic issues have been, the barriers have been removed, and then everyone can be treated equally. But the idea of equity is that we support individuals who may need a little more support, so that they're not falling by the wayside and suffering. And this applies to individuals with traumatic brain injury who we may be treating, to make sure that they are receiving care in a culturally sensitive way that will benefit them the same way that we provide care to individuals from majority culture. In all cases, we should be providing care that is patient-centered. So I'm going to go really quickly through this. Denial is being comfortable with the familiar, not anxious to complicate life with cultural differences, not noticing much cultural difference around you, maintaining separation from others who are different. We have defense, which is a strong commitment to one's own thoughts and feelings about culture and cultural differences. There's some distrust of cultural behavior or ideas that may differ from your own. Being aware of cultures around you, but with relatively incomplete understanding of them, and probably strong negative feelings or stereotypes about some of them. Then I talked about minimization. People from other cultures are pretty much like you under the surface. Awareness that other cultures exist around you with some knowledge about differences in customs and celebrations. And it moves on to acceptance as being aware of your own culture, seeing your own culture as just one of many ways of seeing the world, understanding that people may differ and are just as complex as yourself, understanding that their experience is no less valuable than your experience. As being an area of diversity, this it often is controversial when discussing religion. A lot of people, there's been conflict over being accepting and understanding of others within based on their background, because built into the belief system is that others don't have value. And so it can be complicated. And so from that perspective, understanding that individuals who may hold those religious beliefs, there has to be some kind of sensitivity in dealing with all individuals. And adaptation is recognizing you have more than one cultural perspective available to you, being able to take the perspective of another culture and understand and evaluate situations. This helps you to deal with other cultures in a better way. And then integration, being able to move easily among cultures. So this is kind of a process, and just to think about where you are in the continuum, and this may be different in a given situation. It may be different in different times, depending on the circumstances, depending on who you're dealing with. But the goal is to kind of be more aware of other difference, people who are different from yourself, and being able to manage that, and being also aware of your own biases. So the take-home message is keep an open mind and be willing to learn, become familiar with the lens through which you see the world, realize that others see the world through their own lens that shapes their perception and gives their lives meaning. And it's great to learn about other cultures, but avoid stereotyping and make no assumptions. I usually file things away in the back of my mind as possibilities when I'm dealing with someone who I may perceive to be from a certain culture, but I don't make any assumptions. And always defer to the individual, and that's how we achieve patient-centered care. And then also being aware of systemic limitations and working with others to affect change at the higher policy level wherever possible. So how'd I do on time? All right.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lacarica. It's really, really a wonderful presentation. I really like that last model / continuum. So if you have any questions, if you can put them in the chat box, or if you put them in Q&A, I'll look and relate to Dr. Lacarica. I will say that it looks like Dr. Camacho said, he made a comment, it's a journey and within context for each culture you are learning about. Let's see. Oh, and he also said this was awesome.
Thank you.
Someone else had left a comment about the health outcomes slide earlier in the presentation. They really liked the breakdown of the different areas that you were talking about.
Okay.
Let's see. Excellent points given, research as this is much needed. I'm not seeing, let me see if I have any other questions. So I don't see, let me just look through here.
If there are any questions that, that anyone has or thinks of even after this, that, my email address is here. You can always email me with questions.
I will say that what I did appreciate is the emphasis on intra and interpersonal. Our responsibility as individuals. And I like the way that you were talking about and I think Dr. Camacho was responding to that as well, cultural competence as a process and not an endpoint.
Yeah.
It's almost like a metaphor for living, right? A process and not an endpoint. And having that level of humility and interest, maybe is another word to add to that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. I don't see any other questions, Dr. Lacarica. I guess you were so thorough. Oh wait, here's another question. How do you ensure authenticity in your attempt to enhance your cultural intelligence? From Dr. Camacho.
I'm not sure what is meant by authenticity.
The way I would read that, Dr. Lacarica, is like, so that you are coming across with
coming across
like
to the
coming across
client.
Authentic, like genuine. How do you ensure your genuineness in your attempt to?
When I have asked questions, most of the time people are, at least in my experience, when you take an interest in someone, and sometimes I will even preface it by forgive me for being ignorant, but I'm not sure about whatever it is, and I want to make sure, and I don't want to make any assumptions. Or, I may say, I have worked with someone from this culture before, but I don't want to make any assumptions. Is there, anything that, would, something that is relevant to your goal in treating the person, most of the time, I don't think I've ever had a case where most people are appreciative that someone took the time to actually ask a question about how they view something, or how they, how things are done in their household and their culture, um, you know.
Yeah. So I think so the individual who posed the question is also saying yes, wanting to be informed, meeting people at the same level, and that it sounds like it's again, that genuineness, your tone of voice, your genuine interest, and wanting to assist in any way that you can in that moment.
Yeah, and the goal is just to provide the best and most effective care that's going to be relevant for that person, and helping them understand that understanding certain issues will make it more effective, the kind of care that you can deliver, focusing on things that are relevant.
And someone, Artessa asked, are you going to have any more presentations in 2021? I think yeah.
Oh, I have some poster presentations coming up, but not on this topic exactly, but I have some research that I've done with Latin American populations looking at outcomes, but yeah, the American Congress of Rehabilitation Medicine, I have some things. They haven't been accepted yet, so I don't know that I will be presenting. So I can't say. So
maybe there'll be a Dr. Lacarico website.
We'll see. But
this information, somebody else also said, very informative. I kept thinking of how difficult it would be to sustain a TBI in another country, with little familiarity to the language and the culture. And we're just asking, what are you researching right now, which I think you were just addressing.
Yes, that's actually an issue that I have presented on in the past with a study that I did looking at traumatic brain injury in Latin America, and found that individuals who had I looked at lifetime history of traumatic brain injury, and found that there was a large percentage, I think 30% of individuals had experienced a loss of consciousness from a blow to the head and did not seek medical attention in an emergency room. So this was not the purpose of the study. It was actually an incidental finding. But 30% to lose consciousness and not seek medical attention, it raises a lot of questions as to why. Is it an access issue? And so I've been working on developing protocols to kind of investigate what is going on there. Is it access? Is it education? In some cultures, I've spoken to people where they, if there's not bleeding on the outside, they assume they're fine. So even a loss of consciousness will not lead someone to be concerned if they come to and they're conscious again, and then they're okay. They may have symptoms that they don't realize are associated with hitting their head, things like nausea, vomiting, and not realizing that they had a concussion. This is a brain injury. And so there may be educational issues, health literacy issues, access issues. It's all questions. I did a similar study in the United States and found, surprisingly, among Spanish speakers, there was also, it wasn't as high a percentage, but there was still a percentage of individuals who had lost consciousness and did not seek medical attention. So, yeah, it's definitely an issue, and more research is needed to really understand what's going on.
So I know we're coming to a close, and I want to read this from Alicia. It says, in response to what you're talking about, I think this would be great, as I have experienced many individuals having difficulty with accessing services needed and they have the right to have, but language barriers, transportation made it very difficult. Just an excellent presentation. Yeah, so there are so many variables in what Dr. Lacarica has shared today that each one of those variables could probably be researched extensively.
Yeah, we try and actually look at them in context, like as a whole, and try and account for as much as we can, because they all interact.
Yeah, it becomes quite complex. So I'm pretty sure that we are to close out at 1:10. Am I
Okay.
correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
So if you have completed your presentation, we'll go ahead and close this workshop. I would like to remind the attendees to please sign your name into the chat. This is going to be your sign out sheet. The work evaluation, we'd like you to please complete this workshop evaluation. And also, if you are requesting CHES, CRCC, or social work CEUs, you will need to take a post test, and those are located on our website at bianj.org/post test. So at this time, you've got a few minutes before the next workshop begins. And so you do have time to visit with our exhibitors and also take a look at our poster presentations. You should also have links for those. So hope you enjoyed this workshop and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll give you a call later.
Okay, bye-bye.